In the third chapter of the book of Esther, among the brief court scenes of the 5th century BC Persian court, one man is mentioned as if the remark requires no explanation. His name is Haman, and he holds the position of the second man in the empire of Xerxes, a court dignitary, a powerful official. But after his name stands a single word, which translators reproduce calmly and matter-of-factly, though its meaning scorches anyone familiar with the earlier pages of biblical history. Haman is called the Agagite, a descendant of Agag. And this word is like a bolt of lightning on a clear day, because Agag is the name of a king, the king of a people whom 500 years earlier, the Israelite king Saul had received a direct order to destroy completely and without exception. But he did not destroy him. He left him alive. Precisely this one man. Precisely this king. Thus, one decision made by one man in the 11th century BC echoed 500 years later as a death sentence for the entire Jewish people scattered across the expanse of the Persian Empire. Where did this people, the Amalekites, even come from? Why did their history with Israel last several centuries and invariably appear as bloodshed? And how did it happen that the biblical narrative traces a connection between a Judean nomad wandering in the desert after Egyptian slavery and a Persian nobleman plotting genocide? In this video, we will follow the historical text from the genealogical record in the book of Genesis to the judicial sentence in the book of Esther, examine what is known about the Amalekites from written sources, consider scholarly versions regarding their origin and fate, and try to understand how one thread, stretched in deep antiquity, passed through the centuries without breaking. The history of the Amalekites does not begin with war. It begins with a family feud. And to understand where Amalek himself came from, we must return to one of the most tense scenes in the book of Genesis, the story of the twins Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau were the sons of Isaac and grandsons of Abraham. According to the biblical account, they were born on the same day, but grew up to be completely different people. Esau became a hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was quiet, domestic, and inclined toward calculation. The difference in temperament and character was compounded by the fact that each claimed a special position in the family. The birthright, the right of the eldest son to inheritance and family blessing, traditionally belonged to Esau as the one who emerged first. The first episode that determined the fate of both is described in the 25th chapter of the book of Genesis. Esau returned from hunting hungry and asked Jacob for some red stew, lentil porridge. Jacob agreed to give it in exchange for the birthright. Esau, not valuing what he was giving away, agreed. The deal was concluded. How to assess this event as frivolity, a moment of weakness, or a fundamental difference in what each brother considered important, interpreters debate to this day. But the fact remains, the birthright passed to Jacob. The second episode proved even more painful. In the 27th chapter, Jacob, with the help of his mother Rebekah, deceitfully obtained the blessing of the dying Isaac. Isaac, blind in old age, did not recognize the substitution and blessed Jacob, thinking he was Esau. When Esau came to his father and the truth was revealed, he burst out, in the words of the biblical text, with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and begged his father for any blessing at all for him. Isaac blessed him as he could, with a life by the sword and the possibility of one day throwing off the yoke. But the main blessing, the one that made the eldest son the head of the clan and bearer of the covenant, had already been given to Jacob. Esau's reaction, recorded in the 27th chapter, is brief and unequivocal. "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill Jacob my brother." He did not kill. Jacob fled, but the threat was uttered, and it did not dissolve with the years. This story is important for understanding the Amalekites not as a beautiful backstory, but as a genealogical fact. According to the 36th chapter of the book of Genesis, that part which lists the descendants of Esau, Esau's son Eliphaz had a concubine named Timnah, and it was she who bore Amalek. Thus, Amalek was the grandson of Esau, and consequently, the great-nephew of Jacob. The Amalekites and Israelites are not simply neighboring peoples. According to the biblical genealogy, they are relatives. Rabbinic tradition, recorded in medieval midrashim, adds a detail to this story that gives it an additional dimension. These texts relate that Timnah was a royal daughter, descended from a noble lineage, and that she wished to join the family of Abraham, to enter the sphere of this covenant. She approached Abraham himself, then Isaac, and then Jacob in turn. All three rejected her. Then, according to tradition, she said, "Better to be a maidservant in this people than a noble lady in another," and became Eliphaz's concubine. The meaning of this tradition is twofold. On the one hand, it explains Amalek's origin from rejection. On the other, it indicates that in this family history, there were victims and guilty parties on different sides. Can Amalek and his descendants, the Amalekites, be considered a historically real people and not merely a literary image? Biblical scholars generally regard the Amalekites precisely as a real ethnic group that existed in the Middle East during the Bronze and early Iron Ages. Precisely where their main territory was located is difficult to establish definitively, but biblical texts place them primarily on the Sinai Peninsula, in the Negev, and in areas southeast of Canaan. This was a semi-desert zone, traditionally inhabited by nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes. Egyptian sources do not contain direct mentions of the Amalekites under that name, which in itself is not proof of their non-existence. The Egyptians denoted the nomads of Sinai and the Negev with generalized terms, for example, Shasu, not always specifying which particular tribe was meant. A number of scholars believe the Amalekites may have been part of a broader confederation of Sinai nomads, who periodically appear in Egyptian documents as a threat to trade routes and border areas. Thus, by the time the Israelites found themselves on the Sinai Peninsula after the exodus from Egypt, the Amalekites were already a long-established people, well acquainted with these territories, and, in all likelihood, regarding them as their sphere of influence. The first direct clash between the Amalekites and Israelites is described in the 17th chapter of the book of Exodus. The Israelites had just left Egypt. Behind them, several generations of slavery. Ahead, an unknown land. They were moving through the desert, not yet formed as a military force, still representing a huge, motley column, with the elderly, children, the sick, livestock, and belongings. The Amalekites attacked. However, the choice of place and method of this attack is recorded with unexpected specificity. A later text in Deuteronomy, the 25th chapter, verses 17 and 18, specifically returns to this event and clarifies, "The Amalekites attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off all who lagged behind you when you were hungry and weary. They struck from behind, at the tail of the column, at those who could not walk quickly, the elderly, the sick, the exhausted." From a military tactical point of view, this was an effective technique against an unorganized column that had just emerged from slavery. Israel posed no threat to Amalekite lands, They were passing through Sinai toward Canaan, that is, in the other direction. This attack was not dictated by defensive necessity. It was a choice. It is precisely this distinction, attacking the defenseless without military necessity, that became the reason the biblical text would return again and again to this event over several centuries as a starting point that defined the nature of relations between the two peoples. The Israelites, under the command of Joshua, went out to battle. Meanwhile, Moses went up a hill with his staff in hand. Here occurs one of the strangest and most memorable episodes in the entire book of Exodus. As long as Moses' hands were raised, the Israelites prevailed. When he lowered them from fatigue, the advantage shifted to the Amalekites. Aaron and Hur supported Moses' hands until the sun set. Israel was victorious. The meaning of this image has been interpreted in various ways. Some saw in it an expression that the outcome of battle depends on the spiritual state of the people, not just on military force. Others, the symbolism of prayer and intercession. Rationally inclined scholars viewed the raised hands as a battle signal, visible from a distance and indicating the right direction to the troops. Be that as it may, this image entered cultural memory very firmly. So firmly that several centuries later, the prophet Isaiah and the authors of the Psalms returned to it in various contexts. After the battle came words that determined the entire subsequent logic of attitude toward the Amalekites. Chapter 17, verse 14. Write this for a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua. I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Verse 16 adds, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. This declaration of war, not with a specific army or for a specific reason, but with the people itself, from generation to generation, within the biblical narrative places the Amalekites in a unique position. It is precisely this uniqueness that makes their history so important for understanding a number of key episodes in later biblical history. But first, 400 years. Because between the first clash at Rephidim and the next major scene where the Amalekites step into the foreground in full stature, about 4 centuries pass. And all this time, they did not disappear. The period of the Judges, approximately the 12th to 11th centuries BC, was a time when Israel had no unified state. The 12 tribes lived in Canaan as a confederation, bound by a common religious tradition but lacking unified political authority. Governance was carried out through local chieftains' judges, raised up by crisis situations, not by an institution of hereditary monarchy. The Amalekites appear in the book of Judges several times, and each time in the context of alliances with other peoples against Israel. The 3rd chapter reports that Eglon, king of Moab, united with the Amalekites and Ammonites and captured Jericho. This enslavement lasted 18 years. The 6th chapter, one of the central episodes of the book, describes 7 years of unceasing, devastating raids. The invasion was linked to an alliance of Midianites and Amalekites. They came from the east during the harvest and destroyed the crops, drove off livestock, and destroyed everything that could not be carried away. The biblical text compares this invasion to locusts. They were without number. Israel hid grain in pits and caves. Existence descended to survival. It was in response to this threat that Gideon arose, one of the most famous judges of Israel. The 7th chapter of the book of Judges tells how, with 300 chosen warriors, he attacked the camp of the Midianites and Amalekites at night. A night attack with torches and trumpets caused panic. The enemies fled, and the Israelites pursued them. Gideon's victory became one of those events that firmly entered popular memory. Then, the 8th chapter. After the victory, Gideon moved deeper into Transjordan, pursuing the retreating kings of Midian. Along the way, he asked for help with provisions from the cities of Succoth and Penuel. Both cities refused. "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand?" the elders of Succoth mockingly asked. After the victory, Gideon returned to both cities and punished them for their refusal. This episode is important for understanding the social climate of that era. Fear of the Amalekites and Midianites was so great that even Israelite cities refused to help their own warriors, fearing retaliation in case of their defeat. Several generations after Gideon, in the 10th chapter of the book of Judges, the Amalekites are mentioned in a general list of peoples who oppressed Israel. The invasions continued, their nature unchanged. Raids from the south and east, destruction of crops and livestock, attacks on weak and undefended settlements. The 30th chapter of the first book of Samuel describes an episode from the next era, the time of David, when he was not yet king of all Israel, but only the ruler of Hebron and the leader of his troops. David and his men had been absent for several days, participating in military actions in the north. When they returned to Ziklag, the city David had received from the Philistine king Achish, they saw ruins. The Amalekites had raided the south in their absence. Ziklag had been burned to the ground. All the women and children had been taken captive, including both of David's wives, Ahinoam and Abigail. The reaction of David's warriors, recorded in the biblical text, is telling. They wept until they had no more power to weep, and then began to speak of stoning David. They held him responsible for the loss of their families. David prayed and decided to pursue the captors. In the wilderness, they found an abandoned Egyptian slave, a servant of one of the Amalekites who had fallen ill during the march. He showed them the way. David overtook the Amalekites and destroyed their camp. All the captives were freed, and rich plunder was seized. This episode is interesting for several reasons. First, it shows that at the turn of the 11th to 10th centuries BCE, the Amalekites still acted as a cohesive force, capable of large-scale organized raids. Second, it demonstrates their tactic. They struck precisely when the enemy's main military forces were occupied elsewhere. Third, and this is significant from the perspective of subsequent history, the text mentions that among the captives taken by the Amalekites in Ziklag were people from the Negev and Judah. That is, they operated over a wide area, attacking different Israelite settlements in different regions. If we summarize everything known about the Amalekites over this 400-year period, a picture emerges of a people who did not seek to seize territory or establish settled dominion over Israel. Their goal was not a war of conquest in the classical sense. They chose a moment of vulnerability, struck swiftly, and retreated with plunder. In conditions where Israel lacked a unified military structure and there was no stable coordination among the separate tribes, such tactics were highly effective. But then a time came when everything changed. Israel received a king. The transition to monarchy is one of the pivotal moments in all of biblical history. The prophet Samuel, the last of the great judges, was the central figure in this transition. It was he who anointed the first king of Israel, Saul of the tribe of Benjamin. According to biblical chronology, this happened approximately around 1020 to 1010 BCE. though specific dates vary somewhat among different scholarly traditions. Saul, at the beginning of his reign, proved himself a capable military leader. He defeated the Ammonites, who threatened Gilead, and fought successfully against the Philistines. He had authority and military experience, and it was to him that the order was given, which was to solve the Amalekite problem once and for all. The 15th chapter of the first book of Samuel begins with Samuel conveying to Saul the command to destroy the Amalekites completely. The text is straightforward. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Saul gathers 200,000 warriors, sets out on the campaign, and defeats the Amalekites. The military victory is complete. The enemy army is crushed. The cities are taken. But here occurs what the biblical narrative evaluates as a key violation of the order. Saul spared the life of Agag, king of the Amalekites. Furthermore, the army took the best of the livestock, the choice sheep, oxen, calves, and lambs, and all the valuable property. The explanation Saul later gave to Samuel was this: the best was taken to sacrifice to the Lord. The text, however, notes another detail. But all that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. That is, the logic was as follows: everything valuable, preserved; everything worthless, destroyed. This is directly opposite to the received command, which required the destruction of everything. Samuel learned of what had happened even before meeting Saul. The words describing his reaction are restrained but weighty. And the word of the Lord came to Samuel: I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. Samuel prayed all night. In the morning, he went to Saul. And here occurs a dialogue that has become one of the most quoted in the history of biblical exegesis. Saul met the prophet with the words, "Blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." Samuel asked, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears, and the lowing of oxen that I hear?" Saul began to explain, "The people brought the animals to sacrifice to God." Samuel stopped him and spoke the words that have entered history. "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry." This is a moment not only of Saul's personal drama. It is a fundamental theological statement that will run through the entire prophetic tradition. Formal religious observance, sacrifices, rites, rituals, cannot replace submission to the will of God. Obedience is primary. Sacrifice is secondary. Saul chose sacrifice over obedience, and this choice proved fateful. Samuel declared that the kingdom would be taken from Saul. Then he demanded that Agag be brought. Agag was allowed to approach. According to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament created in the 3rd to 2nd centuries BCE, Agag came trembling. The Masoretic text, which forms the basis of later translations, renders his last words differently. He is said to have stated, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." The meaning is ambiguous. Perhaps he thought he would no longer be harmed. Perhaps it is the proud irony of a man facing death. Samuel responded, As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And he himself killed Agag. But the killing of Agag did not mean the end of the line. It is here that rabbinic tradition offers a detail that closes the arc stretching across 500 years. The Talmud and medieval Midrashim preserve an indication that Agag, while he was alive, that is, in the interval between the battle and his execution, could have left offspring. Literally, a few days or hours could have had consequences that no one foresaw. It is precisely this logic that explains what would happen 5 centuries later. Now on screen unfolds the 5th century BCE. We move from the scorched deserts of Sinai and the hills of Canaan to the brilliant court of Persian Susa, one of the capitals of the Achaemenid Empire. Before us is the very beginning of the story of Esther, one of the most read and popular texts of the Jewish Bible, known even outside religious tradition as a gripping court detective story with unexpected twists. The action takes place during the time of King Ahasuerus. Under this name, the Persian king Xerxes I, who ruled from 486 to 465 BCE, appears in Jewish tradition. It is here in this story that a figure appears whom we spoke of at the very beginning, Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. His origin is indicated in the text twice, in the 3rd and 8th chapters. Agagite. This word is not a neutral designation of birthplace or a random toponym. It means belonging to the line of Agag, that very king of the Amalekites whom Saul spared. How accurate this genealogy was in a genealogical sense, or whether it was more symbolic in nature, is a question on which scholars have no single answer. But that the compiler of the text wanted the reader to connect Haman specifically with Agag, and through him with the Amalekites, this is beyond doubt. Haman attained the highest court position, becoming, in the words of the text, second only to the king. All courtiers bowed down before him, by order of the king himself. Everything proceeded as usual until one man refused. Mordecai, a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, who was raising his orphaned cousin Esther and who worked at the king's gate, did not bow to Haman. The reason for his refusal is not explicitly explained in the text. He himself told his colleagues that he was a Jew, and this is the only indication. Interpretations vary. Some see here a religious prohibition against bowing to one who should be considered an enemy of Israel. Others, simply the principled stance of a man refusing to pay homage to one to whom he owes no such honor. Haman's reaction was disproportionate by any ordinary logic. He disdained the thought of punishing Mordecai alone and decided to destroy the entire Jewish people within the Persian Empire. The text emphasizes this scale: to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. Haman appeared before the king with a proposal formulated in standard bureaucratic terms. There is, he said, a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. He proposed to issue a decree for their destruction, and also offered to pay a large sum into the royal treasury, evidently from the expected confiscation of property. The king agreed and gave Haman his signet ring, the sign of sanction. The decree was drawn up, translated into all the languages of the peoples of the empire, and sent to all the provinces. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the date was determined by casting lots, Purim in Hebrew, from which the name of the festival originates. All Jews were to be destroyed. Men, women, children. Their property was to be confiscated. The Persian Empire in those years encompassed a vast territory from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, from the Caspian Sea to Egypt. The Jewish population was scattered throughout this territory after the deportations of the Assyrian and Babylonian eras. Had this decree been carried out, nothing would have remained of the people. It is here that Esther enters the story. She had become queen without revealing her Jewish origin, on Mordecai's advice. When the decree was issued, Mordecai conveyed to her the news of what was happening and urged her to act. His words, quoted in the 4th chapter, contain the famous phrase, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther was in a dangerous position. According to Persian palace law, no one, including the queen, could appear before the king unsummoned on pain of death. An exception was possible only if the king extended the golden scepter as a sign of acceptance. She fasted and prayed for 3 days, then entered the inner court. The king received her. He extended the scepter. But she did not immediately rush to expose the plot. She invited the king and Haman to a feast. At the feast, she again said nothing. She invited them to a second feast. This restrained delay allowed parallel events to unfold. Haman, in the interval between the 2 feasts, burning with hatred for Mordecai, ordered a gallows 50 cubits high, about 23 meters, to be erected specifically for Mordecai. That same night, the king could not sleep. He ordered the court chronicles to be read to him. By chance, or not by chance, the readers came to the record of how Mordecai had once uncovered a plot against the king and thus saved his life. The king asked, had Mordecai been rewarded? No honor had been bestowed upon him. The next morning, Haman, who had come to court to request permission to hang Mordecai, was puzzled by a strange question. What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Thinking the king meant him, Haman proposed the most lavish honor he could imagine and was immediately sent to carry it out for Mordecai. At the second banquet, Esther finally revealed herself. She disclosed her origin and informed the king that her people were condemned to destruction. The king asked, "Who did this?" She answered, "This wicked man is Haman." The king went out into the garden. Whether shocked or enraged, the text does not specify. Haman threw himself onto Esther's couch to beg for mercy. The king returned and saw him, and interpreted what was happening as an assault on the queen in his own house. Haman was seized, and one of the courtiers immediately reported, "By the way, Haman has erected a high gallows for Mordecai." The king said, "Hang him on it." Haman was hanged on the gallows he himself had built. This is one of those motifs found in the most diverse traditions and literatures of the world, commonly called poetic justice. The trap snaps shut on the one who set it. The instrument of destruction turns against its author. But the problem was not fully resolved by Haman's execution alone. The issued decree, according to Persian law, could not simply be revoked. A royal decree sealed with the king's signet ring was irreversible. A solution was found as follows. Mordecai and Esther were granted the right to compose an additional decree. It permitted the Jews in all provinces to unite and defend themselves, to take up arms against those who would attempt to carry out the first order. This second decree was also dispatched throughout the empire. On the appointed day, the 13th day of the month of Adar, the Jews organized armed self-defense. In the capital, Susa, the battle lasted 2 days.
In the provinces, 1 day.
Haman's 10 sons were killed. On the 15th night of the month of Adar, or the 14th in the provinces, Jews throughout the Persian Empire held a celebration. This celebration came to be called Purim, from the lot Purim that Haman had once cast to choose the date for the destruction of the Jews. What the enemy had prepared as an instrument of doom became an annual reminder of salvation. The book of Esther is the only book in the Hebrew Bible in which the name of God is never mentioned. This in itself is the subject of prolonged theological debate. Some interpreters see in this an indication that God acted through people, remaining behind the scenes. Others believe the text was originally a secular historical narrative, included in the canon later and not without controversy. Evidence survives that some Jewish sages in the early Christian era doubted the canonical status of this book. Ultimately, it entered the canon and remained in it. Now let us pause and look at this entire story in its historical dimension. What exactly happened to the Amalekites as a people? By approximately the 8th to 7th centuries BCE, mentions of them in sources become increasingly rare. Assyrian chronicles, recording the fates of many peoples of the region, practically do not mention the Amalekites. This aligns with biblical data. In the first book of Chronicles, chapter 4, in connection with the reign of Hezekiah, it is mentioned that 500 men from the tribe of Simeon defeated the remnant of the Amalekites in the mountains of Seir. This is the last direct mention of the Amalekites as an active force. Thereafter, they disappear from the historical narrative. It appears that the Amalekites, as a distinct people, ceased to exist sometime during the era of Assyrian expansion. The Assyrian conquest of the 8th to 7th centuries BCE reshaped the entire Near East, and many small peoples of the region were either destroyed or assimilated into larger ethnic groups. The Amalekites, a semi-nomadic people without fortified cities or permanent structures, were particularly vulnerable. But then, what to make of Haman, the Agagite, in the era of Persian dominance, in the 5th century BCE, when the Amalekites as a people no longer existed? Here, scholarly opinions diverge. Some believe the designation Agagite may not have been ethnic, but rather a genealogical marker, indicating actual descent from a specific lineage. In that case, we are dealing with a descendant of a surviving line that preserved the memory of its roots. Others consider this designation to be more symbolic or literary in nature. The compiler of the Book of Esther wanted to present Haman as the embodiment of the eternal enemy, an Amalekite in a spiritual, not literal sense. A third group offers an intermediate version. The historical Haman may have belonged to one of the Anatolian or Near Eastern clans that trace their origins to ancient Near Eastern royal lines. Be that as it may, the line of reasoning that the biblical author offers the reader is clear. A descendant of Agag nearly destroyed the descendants of Israel. An unfinished action in one generation nearly became a catastrophe for subsequent generations 500 years later. Something else occurs here. When the Book of Esther introduces Mordecai, it reports his genealogy with evident care. He is the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin. Scholars have long noted that this list appears as a deliberate indication of a connection to King Saul. It was Saul, a descendant of the same tribe of Benjamin from the house of Kish, who once failed to carry out the order. And it is Mordecai from that same house who finds himself at the center of the confrontation with Haman the Amalekite. This is not a random detail. The biblical text here constructs a symmetry across centuries. What one descendant of Benjamin left undone, another completed. The Saulide line got a second chance and took it. It is this symmetry that transforms the history of the Amalekites from a chronicle of wars into something more complex, into a narrative about consequences that do not end with the death of the perpetrator. A decision made in one moment on a battlefield in the 11th century BCE echoed 500 years later, not where it was made and not for those who made it. What exactly were the Amalekites in the broader historical context? They were a semi-nomadic people occupying the zone of the Sinai Peninsula, the Negev, and adjacent areas of Transjordan. Their survival strategy was based on mobility. They did not build cities that could be besieged and taken. They disappeared into the desert and reappeared from there. In the early Iron Age, when Israel was just beginning to form as a state, such tactics were quite effective. From the perspective of Near Eastern history as a whole, the Amalekites represent one of many peoples of the nomadic and semi-nomadic belt that existed on the periphery or between major civilizational centers. Such peoples often played the role of a destabilizing factor for sedentary societies, not because they were inherently more cruel or malicious, but because their survival strategy was incompatible with the peaceful existence of settled neighbors. Nevertheless, the biblical tradition views the story of the Amalekites not merely as a historical chronicle, but as a demonstration of a principle that can be formulated as follows. Unfinished decisions have consequences that extend beyond the lives of those who made them. This idea that the actions or inaction of one person or one generation shape reality for those who come after is one of the central ideas of historical thinking in general, independent of religious dimension. History is full of examples where mercy or indecision at one moment turned into catastrophe for subsequent generations, or where, conversely, a wise decision made at a seemingly insignificant moment ensured stability for centuries to come. This is why the story of the Amalekites holds so firmly in cultural memory. It demonstrates this pattern in a condensed, extremely concrete form. A specific king, a specific prisoner, a specific gallows 5 centuries later. The Book of Esther, if considered as a historical document, not just a religious text, is notable for another reason. It is painted against the backdrop of a genuinely historical reality. The Persian Achaemenid Empire, its administrative structure, the custom of sending out royal decrees in different languages, the practice of appointing governors in provinces, the very name of the capital, Susa. All of this finds confirmation in independent sources. Greek historians, Herodotus and Xenophon, describe the Persian court. Excavations at Susa have yielded rich archaeological material. In other words, the actual historical context of the book is well established. As for Haman himself, a historical personage with that name and such a position at the Persian court in the 5th century BCE, independent sources do not confirm it. This does not mean he did not exist. Achaemenid court documents have not survived in full, and many significant officials remain outside the written evidence that has reached us. But proving his historical existence apart from the biblical text is currently impossible. Nevertheless, the symbolic and structural value of this story does not depend on its verifiability in every detail. Its value lies elsewhere. In the arc it traces over more than 1,000 years, from the jealous resentment of 2 brothers in Isaac's herds to a gallows in the palace of the Persian king. The Amalekites began their history as descendants of the rejected. They chose war as a way of life, not once, but again and again, generation after generation. They attacked the weak, feared neither gods nor neighbors, disappeared into the desert and returned. And in the end, they disappeared themselves, absorbed by that very grand grinding down of peoples carried out by the Assyrian and Persian empires in the first millennium BCE. But the memory of them did not disappear.
The final consequence of their history was Haman, a man in whom the biblical text gathered everything the Amalekites embodied. Personal offense elevated to state policy, hatred taking the form of a legal document, and a plan to destroy a people that began with a refusal to bow to a single individual. And here appeared Esther and Mordecai, people who did not retreat at the most critical moment. She risked her life by entering the king's presence uninvited. He refused to bow, knowing what it threatened. Both acted not because they were certain of the outcome, but because they could not do otherwise. This is what the book of Esther uses to settle the long account, a story that began in the tents and shelters of the Sinai Peninsula, passed through the battlefields of the era of the judges and the Israelite kings, and ended not on a battlefield, but in the halls of the Persian palace, at a festive table where the queen spoke the right words at the right time. The story of the Amalekites continues to pose questions for which each new generation of readers has its own answers. What to do with unfinished tasks? When is a partial solution worse than no solution? Can the cost of one unmade decision be measured if its consequences stretch over hundreds of years? These are questions not only for students of the Bible, they are questions for all who think about history, about what is passed from one generation to another, not only in genes and language, but in unfinished business, unresolved grievances, unmade choices. Amalek was not a random name in the genealogical table of Genesis chapter 36. He was the first link in a chain that stretched 1,000 years, and the chain was broken precisely when it was hardest to break. Before concluding this discussion, it is worth pausing on several aspects that rarely receive central attention in retellings of this story. The first of these is the question of who Esau was in the biblical tradition, and what place the Amalekites occupied in the broader picture of peoples descended from Jacob's brother. Esau, according to the biblical text, became the progenitor of the Edomites, a people who occupied the mountainous country southeast of the Dead Sea, called Edom or Seir. The Edomites are present in biblical history throughout the monarchic period, as sometimes hostile, sometimes neutral neighbors of Israel. Some of them even became allies of Israel in certain eras. The relationship between Israel and Edom was fundamentally different from that with the Amalekites. Edom was still recognized as a brother, albeit a rival, and often a hostile one. The book of Deuteronomy states explicitly, "Do not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother." An Edomite was permitted to enter Israelite society after several generations. An Amalekite was not. This distinction itself points to the fundamental difference the biblical tradition drew between two peoples descended from the same family. Edom is a blood rival with whom one can deal. Amalek is something else. Why? Rabbinic thought attempted to answer this question through the concept of a double grievance. Amalek was the son of Timnah, and Timnah, as we recall, was rejected by Abraham himself and his sons.
This means that Amalek carried within him both the wound of his grandfather Esau, the lost birthright, and the wound of his grandmother Timnah, rejection by the very people to whom she wished to belong. Both these wounds were unhealed, both transformed into a hereditary hatred. This psychological interpretation is not an invention of modern psychology. It entered the narrative quite early.
The Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, compiled presumably in the 4th or 5th century CE but containing earlier layers, states directly, Timnah became the concubine of Eliphaz, only to attach herself to the descendants of Abraham. Her motivation was a desire to belong. The refusal of acceptance resulted in the creation of an enemy. This is not merely a family story. It is a warning about what happens to those who are rejected. The question of whether the fate of the Amalekites was predetermined or whether they had an opportunity to change it occupied biblical commentators no less than the question of their origin. Unlike Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, to which the prophet Jonah brought a message of impending judgment and which repented, leading to the judgment being postponed, the Amalekites are never mentioned in the context of repentance or changing their ways. In the books of Exodus, Judges, and Samuel, they always appear in the same guise: attack, raid, destruction. Some interpreters emphasize this silence.
If even one generation of Amalekites had decided to stop the war, to ask for peace, peace would have been possible. This is how other nations acted. This is how the Gibeonites from the book of Joshua acted, entering into an alliance with the Israelites through deception. The deception was uncovered, but the alliance was ultimately upheld. Nations that expressed a willingness for peace could exist alongside Israel. The Amalekites did not avail themselves of this opportunity. Whether this is truly the case or the biblical text simply did not preserve such episodes is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. The texts of the Old Testament are written from a specific point of view. It is the history of Israel viewed through the prism of its religious identity. The voice of the Amalekites is not heard in them. They had no written records that have reached us, and no chroniclers who recorded their perspective on events.
This is an important methodological reminder for any historian.
What we know about the Amalekites, we know from the sources of their adversary. This does not mean these sources are false. They may be accurate in describing events, but they do not give us the internal picture. The second aspect worthy of attention is the role of Samuel in this story. Samuel is a figure standing at the boundary of two eras. He is the last of the great judges, and simultaneously the man who anointed both of Israel's first kings, Saul and David. His relationship with Saul is one of the most psychologically rich narratives in the first book of Samuel. When Samuel announced Saul's rejection, it was clearly painful for both.
The 15th chapter contains a short phrase that conceals much.
And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel mourned for Saul. Samuel fulfilled his role, spoke the words he deemed necessary, and yet grieved for the man to whom he was obliged to pronounce those words. This did not make Samuel a ruthless executor of a sentence. It made him a man who understood the cost of what he was saying. One of the highest tensions in the 15th chapter is precisely this combination: a clear understanding of what must happen, and personal sorrow for the man to whom it is happening. When Samuel carried out the sentence on Agag, he spoke words addressed no longer to Saul. As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. This is a reminder of Rephidim, of the attack on the stragglers in the Israelite column, of the women and children killed in the wilderness. The judgment of Agag is inscribed in the same logic. Measure for measure, the action returns to the one who committed it. The third aspect, and perhaps the most intriguing for researchers, concerns what happens to Agag in the interval between the battle and his execution. The biblical text does not indicate how much time passed between Agag's capture and his meeting with Samuel. Samuel learned of what had happened from God at night. Perhaps it was the same night after the battle, or the next, or several days later. The text does not specify. It is precisely in this uncertainty that the rabbinic tradition found space for explanation. During this interval, Agag could have had offspring. One of the Tosafot Midrashim explicitly states, "That night he, Agag, begot a child." This is, of course, a homiletic explanation, intended to fill a logical gap in the narrative, but in itself it is very telling. The authors of this explanation wanted to show that even at the moment when everything seemed decided, the consequences of incomplete execution had already managed to manifest. Historically, it is impossible to verify whether Haman was literally a descendant of Agag. 500 years is roughly 20 to 25 generations. Preserving a genealogical line and clan identity through that many generations is entirely possible. History knows examples. But it requires the conscious cultivation of this memory within the clan. If Haman's family truly preserved the memory of their descent from Agag over 5 centuries, that in itself speaks to the fact that the hatred and the wound were alive, not forgotten. The fourth aspect is the historical place of the Book of Esther in Jewish tradition. The Book of Esther is the foundation of the holiday of Purim, one of the most widely celebrated Jewish holidays. Its date is floating. It falls on the 14th to 15th day of the month of Adar in the Hebrew calendar, which roughly corresponds to February to March in the Gregorian calendar. The holiday has a joyful, carnival-like character. The scroll of Esther is read in synagogues, and at every mention of Haman's name, it is customary to make noise and drown it out. This custom, to drown out the name, carries the same logic as the formula to blot out the memory of Amalek. Victory is expressed not only in the physical elimination of the enemy, but also in erasing him from memory, or conversely, in turning the mention of his name into an occasion for joy that his plan failed. Interestingly, Purim is the only major Jewish holiday associated not with events that occurred in the land of Israel, but with the diaspora. Not with Egypt, not with Sinai, not with Jerusalem, but with the Persian provinces, where Jews lived as a scattered people among strangers. This makes it a holiday of a special kind, a celebration of survival where the people had no army, no territory, no statehood, only one person who risked entering the king's presence without permission. One must also mention how the image of Amalek developed in later Jewish tradition. Beginning with the Second Temple period, and especially intensively after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Amalek began to be used as a metaphor for any mortal enemy of Israel, regardless of their literal ethnic origin. Egypt symbolized slavery and oppression. Amalek symbolized precisely the desire for annihilation. In the Middle Ages, various enemies of the Jewish people were identified with Amalek in rabbinic literature. In the 20th century, the word was applied to Nazi Germany, and it is this context that gave it particular sharpness. linking the biblical metaphor with the historical reality of the Holocaust.
The semantic weight of the word proved so intense that today it remains one of the most sensitive terms in Jewish religious rhetoric. All this indicates that the history of the Amalekites, for all its historical specificity, has long transcended the chronicle of one Bronze Age tribe that disappeared 2,500 years ago. It has become a conceptual category, a way of speaking about a certain type of hostility, about the striving for the complete annihilation of what the other represents. And here history closes its circle in the most unexpected way. A people whose history began with rejection gave birth to a tradition of hatred. The tradition of hatred passed through 4 centuries of wars. One spared king, after 500 years, could become the cause of the complete destruction of the people against whom all this hatred was directed. And at the very last moment, a few days before the sentence was to be carried out, 2 people were found who did not turn away. Esther, who had concealed her origins for safety, revealed herself at the moment when silence became tantamount to destruction. Mordecai, who refused to bow to a man whom everyone bowed to, became that first spark that ignited the entire crisis, and he also found himself at the center of its resolution. Haman built a gallows for Mordecai and was hanged on it himself. It is difficult to find a clearer image of how a plan to destroy another turns into the destruction of its author. This is not merely literary beauty. It is a structural logic that the biblical narrative unfolds with a consistency worthy of geometry. The history of the Amalekites is not a history of a villainous people destroyed by a righteous one. It is a history of what happens when grievance becomes identity, and hatred becomes a hereditary inheritance, of how unresolved conflicts do not dissipate over time. They await their hour. Of how one deferred decision can cost incomparably more than it seemed at the moment of its postponement. And of how sometimes one woman, entering the throne room of a Persian king without invitation, changes everything.